Welcome to the webinar on Learning for All, the guidelines on inclusion of learners with disabilities in open and distance learning revised. This webinar has been prepared by Associate Professor Dianne Chambers, who is a UNESCO consultant. There are a number of considerations that underpin the Learning for All guidelines. Firstly, there are approximately 1 billion or 15% of people in the world who have a disability. It is imperative to consider the needs of people with a disability to ensure they have quality life, including access to appropriate education. The guidelines were developed by UNESCO along with international, regional and national partners in a collaborative model to ensure all voices are heard. Open solutions including open and distance learning, open educational resources, free and open source software, and open access to scientific information were utilised to enhance accessibility for persons with disability. The guidelines are consistent with and support the UNESCO OER recommendation, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, the Sustainable Development Goals, and COVID responses to learning. Throughout the guidelines, there are a number of key terms that are used. Here we will define some of these terms to assist you to effectively access the guidelines. The first of these is persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments, which, interaction with various barriers, may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Open and distance learning, or ODL as it's commonly known, refers to the provision of flexible educational opportunities in terms of access and multiple modes of knowledge acquisition. The open in open and distance learning refers to any scheme of educational training that seeks systematically to remove barriers to learning, whether these barriers are concerned with the age of the person, the time of the use, the place in which the person is using those materials, or the space in which they're using them. Open educational resources, or OER, are any type of educational materials that are in the public domain or that are introduced with an open licence. Open educational resources range from textbooks to curricula, syllabi, lecture notes, assignments, tests, projects, audio, video, and animation. OER allows users to legally and freely use, copy, adapt and reshare content in line with specific Creative Commons licenses. Free and open source software refers to software that has been designed by a person or by a group of people, which is then distributed freely for use. This software can not only be used freely, but can also sometimes be adapted for particular circumstances. Open access to scientific information, or OA, is the provision of free access to peer-reviewed scholarly research and information, often found via online open access journals. The Learning for All resource consists of guidelines, actions and checklists. Guidelines are provided for a range of different stakeholders, including governments, institutions, instructors, quality assurance and recognition bodies, and there is also an emergency movement to online and distance learning set of guidelines. The actions articulate what is required at each stage. There are prerequisite actions before online and distance learning is considered, the implementation of online and distance learning actions, the monitoring of how ODL is working, and there are also actions for the emergency movement to online and distance learning. Checklists are provided which operationalise each of these areas. For example, there are a prerequisite actions checklist, an implementation actions checklist, a monitoring processes checklist, and an emergency response actions checklist. There are a number of guidelines for governments to consider when supporting the development of open and distance learning. Among these is the development of legislation and policy to support open and distance learning, particularly for people with disabilities. They should also act to facilitate liaison between all stakeholders in open and distance learning. Governments can also work to ensure access to appropriate assistive technology is available to people with disabilities to allow them to access open and distance learning. In education documents, the inclusion of free and open source software, open education resources, and open access research is especially useful. Infrastructure should be developed to support open and distance learning for people with disabilities, which includes training for instructors. Governments should work collaboratively with organisations and associations for people with disabilities. There are a number of specific guidelines for institutions to help them support people with disabilities in accessing open and distance learning. Institutions should consider the potential enrolment of people with disabilities in ODL and the need to include different modalities, to vary presentation of content and to modify assessment where necessary. Designing content using universal design for learning principles will work to ensure that the needs of all students are considered at the beginning of the planning. The use of free and open source software, open educational resources, and open access to research will assist to address accessibility issues in ODL programs. The training requirements of all users should be considered and planned. Institutions also need to ensure that assistive technology is able to be used to support the student throughout their learning journey. Having regular feedback mechanisms in place will ensure that areas of difficulty can be identified and addressed early. Institutions should also establish support services and advertise them widely to all participants. Guidelines for instructors provide direction in regards to students and content. Initially, instructors should seek information on the functional capabilities of all their students. They should include pedagogies which are as much as possible accessible for all and initiate periodic contact with the students to assess their progress within the course. They should be actively examining their own content for accessibility on a regular basis and modifying content according to context in which it's used and modalities that the students are accessing. For difficulties that may arise, instructors can seek open educational resources and free and open source software solutions to address those needs. They should also be collecting data on student experience and applying the findings to the next iteration of ODL. There are guidelines for quality assurance and recognition bodies. These bodies should apply principles of fair and non-discriminatory recognition of qualifications, which may be undertaken in non-traditional modes. They should also develop an understanding of issues related to ensuring the inclusion of persons with disabilities in open and distance learning. Quality assurance and recognition criteria may need to be revisited to ensure quality teaching and learning for persons with disabilities in open and distance learning. There are also guidelines that have been provided in response to the recent COVID-19 pandemic to support institutions and instructors who have had to rapidly move learning to an online and distance learning mode. These guidelines are designed to be used where open and distance learning has not been previously considered. The guidelines suggest that educational institutions should be guided by national policy in regards to the types of content and timelines for program completion. Institutions are encouraged to identify any disabilities and other special needs to be addressed during the open and distance learning. The use of open education resources and open access to relevant research information should be examined, as accessible content may already be available to institutions. Appropriate staff should be identified to liaise with students and their families throughout the process, and the selection of an appropriate platform or system which accommodates all students' needs is required, many of which are freely available. The provision of devices and access to internet resources is also required, particularly for those who have modality differences. Additional funding may be required to provide devices, training, and other infrastructure for open and distance learning. In order to make open and distance learning accessible for persons with disabilities, there are a number of actions which are required for all stakeholders. These actions include prerequisite actions before ODL is put in place, implementation actions during ODL, and monitoring processes throughout are also required. In addition, emergency response actions may be utilised during emergency situations where ODL has not been previously used. There are a number of actions that can be undertaken at various stages in the process. Prerequisite actions consist of selecting appropriate open and distance learning platforms, devising content, and considering modalities of all users. Implementation actions consist of effectively using the platforms, streamlining content, and supporting a variety of different modalities in the open and distance learning context. Monitoring processes consist of assessing and adjusting platforms where required, determining the suitability of content for a wide variety of users, and examining how students with different modalities are accessing the content. In addition, there are emergency response actions that can be undertaken in emergency situations, particularly where ODL has not previously been used. These emergency response actions consist of selecting and utilising platforms, developing open and distant learning content in an emergency situation, and assessing student needs and modalities. Prerequisite actions are those that educators and developers should take prior to the dissemination of ODL resources and programs, particularly those that are to be accessed by people with disability. The checklists are designed to operationalise the actions, and as you can see, there are a number of checklist items under each of the 3 prerequisite actions. For example, under selecting platforms, an institutional policy should be developed through consultation with stakeholders. Selection and appointment of responsible individuals to ensure the implementation of the institutional policy on accessibility, establishment of criteria and procedures for the selection of technology solutions should all be developed. The Implementation Actions Checklist articulates what actions educators and developers should take over the duration of the ODL course to ensure that people with disabilities are able to participate to the greatest extent possible. For example, if we are looking at the action of streamlining content, checklist items include regular assessment of the accessibility of that content is undertaken. Instructors should make sure that tools to assess the accessibility of websites are used, of which there is a variety available. In addition, they should identify and address poorly accessible components regularly, as well as taking timely and effective action on concerns considering gender and Indigenous specificities. The Monitoring Processes Checklist is important to assess the ongoing and final outcomes of the open and distance learning and the satisfaction level of all users. For example, when examining modalities, instructors can collect data regularly on a wide variety of user experiences, compiling a database of known difficulties and potential solutions so that all can use these in the future. Appropriate open educational resources and content, including free and open source software, should be identified, and data on platforms and software must conform to accessibility requirements. In response to COVID-19 and other potential emergency situations which may arise in some countries, an emergency response action checklist has been developed. This checklist is concerned with selecting and utilising appropriate platforms, as well as developing the open and distance learning content in an emergency situation, which may require developers and educators to modify the content and assessment. Universal design for learning principles should be used to develop the content. When assessing student needs and modalities to determine who requires support, institutions and instructors should also identify the needs of students with disability in regards to training. A number of accommodations can be made for specific functional areas. For example, students with vision impairment can be provided with screen reader software. They may use a Braille refreshable display or text-only browser. We should be looking to provide text alternatives for any graphics that are used, possibly adjusting the contrast or providing capacity to adjust the contrast, and providing accessible PDF documents where possible. Students with hearing impairment benefit from text captioning or transcripts of content, sign language interpreters where possible, use of a relay service or printed materials. Students with mobility difficulties may benefit from page turners, alternative mice or keyboards, speech recognition software, accessible buildings, and the use of switch interfaces. Students who have specific learning disability may use books on a CD, a tablet, or a USB. They might use speech output on a computer or speech input to assist with writing. They should also be reading texts at an appropriate readability level. Students with speech issues can use email or a chat room where the student can type a response to convey thoughts and ideas. Asynchronous learning, where the student does not have to be present or participate, is also useful for students with speech difficulties. The guidelines provide a number of examples of free and open source software. Here a few have been selected to illustrate the types of software that is available. For example, My Study Bar is free portable software which supports students with literacy difficulties. It allows the student to change background colours, convert text on the page to a single line of text at a time, use coloured overlays, or have text read aloud to them. Let Me Type is free and open source software that assists with auto-completion of words, text prediction, regardless of the program that the user is using. It also offers suggestions by guessing a word after the first 2 or 3 letters are typed. Sakai is a free open source learning management system, which is particularly useful for institutions which may not have access to expensive learning management systems. Sakai's core features are accessible for people with disabilities. Another free and open source software is Balabolka, which converts text to speech using an inbuilt or pre-installed computer voice. You can also create an audio file for later use. In addition to those already mentioned, there are a number of other key annexes that are contained within the guidelines. These include a list of available open and distance learning journals, open education resource sources, and a glossary of terms. Thank you to all who contributed to the development of the original guidelines and the current revision, including members of the International Disability Alliance and the International Disability and Development Consortium. Thank you.